By the end of this video, you will know which quarterbacks are capable of being the QB1 for us in fantasy football. I'm going to take a look at the past 5 years QB1 finishes, take a look at their average passing yards, passing touchdowns, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns, as well as the minimum thresholds for each one of these stats, as well as their fantasy points per game in a 4-point per touchdown league, and see which of the top quarterbacks are capable of finishing with these low marks and averages. Please remember to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. So the past 5 QB1 finishes are Lamar Jackson in 2019, Josh Allen in 2020, Josh Allen again in 2021, Mahomes in 2022, and Josh Allen again in 2023. One consistent theme is owning Josh Allen is a good idea. When we look at the fantasy points per game finishes here, that is in a 6-point per touchdown format. I'm going to use 4 points per touchdown because that's generally the common league setting. So when we take a look at the low marks and averages, I've already converted that to a 4-point per touchdown format. But in case you are in a 6-point per touchdown league, those are the fantasy points per game finishes. You generally need around at least 27 points per game and a max of about 30. So over the past 5 years, the QB1 has averaged 43.27 passing yards, 36 passing touchdowns, 654 rushing yards, and 8 rushing touchdowns. This includes low marks of 31.27 passing yards by Lamar Jackson, 29 passing touchdowns by Josh Allen this past season, 358 rushing yards by Mahomes in 2022, and also 4 rushing touchdowns by Mahomes in 2022. And in a 4-point per touchdown format, that's 24.4 fantasy points per game on average for the QB1. So the first quarterback is Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. When we think about Josh Allen, we think of consistent fantasy dominance for us. He's been the QB1 in 3 of the past 5 seasons, and this past season as the QB1, he averaged 24.2 fantasy points per game. He really became a dominant fantasy force when Stefon Diggs arrived. When we think about his situation now, though, Stefon Diggs was traded to Houston, so now he has an above-average tight end in Dalton Kincaid, a pretty good pass-catching running back in James Cook. They drafted rookie Keon Coleman. I don't really like how they're going to use him, so I don't think he's going to be very fantasy-friendly for us this season, or really very friendly for Josh Allen in the X role, although I do think he's going to be good in the red zone. And besides that, they have Curtis Samuel and Khalil Shakir, so it is the worst supporting cast he's had since Stefon Diggs has arrived. But when we think about his fantasy finishes, in his rookie season, his 18.2 was good for 14th. In his second season, his 18.2 was good for 11th. In his third season, which is when Stefon Diggs arrived, his 25.4 were good for first. His 24.6 the next year were also good for first. Then in 2022, his 24.3 were good for third. And obviously this past season, his 24.2 were good for first. So I do worry that we're going to see a little bit of a dip in his fantasy points per game, but he's still an elite quarterback and is one of the most aggressive rushers of the football that there is. So he's still likely to have a very good rushing floor for us in 2024. So Josh Allen is 6'5", 237, and he's 28.2 years old. When we look at his metrics, his 4.7 540-yard dash is in the 72nd percentile, giving him a 118.1 speed score, which is in the 78th percentile, an 11.3 agility score, which is in the 71st percentile, a 62 mile per hour velocity in terms of his throwing velocity, which is 100th percentile. This guy is an absolute cannon, and I don't really care too much about the Wonderlic score, but still 85th percentile. When we look at his passing yards, his 43.06 were good for 4th in the NFL. Now, it says that his 0.68 fantasy points per dropback was good for 2nd. That depends on how many dropbacks are necessary to be included in this stat. One player I'm going to mention later is actually higher than that and did lead the league. You just did it in a limited amount of snaps. So you could argue 2nd or 3rd, just depending on your cutoff point. So his accuracy rating versus man was good for 3rd in the NFL, and his accuracy rating versus zone was also 3rd in the NFL. So consistently accurate throughout whatever coverage he's facing. His accuracy rating of 6.8 was good for 3rd as well. So this guy is a very, very accurate quarterback and very mobile. That's part of why he's been so elite. Then here is the biggest reason why he has been a consistent fantasy force for us. His 111 carries ranked 4th with 6.5 per game, which is 7th. including 36 red zone carries, which was second in the entire NFL. So he's used where it counts the most in the rushing game. His red zone carries per game of 2.1 was good for second. His total rushing yards of 524 were good for fourth, giving him 30.8 per game, which is eighth. And obviously, he broke the rushing touchdown alongside Jalen Hurts, so his 15 were good for first. This is what gives him the highest floor and potentially the highest ceiling of any quarterback any given week. When we take a look at his passing yards, passing touchdowns, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns, as well as his fantasy points per game versus the low threshold metrics to be the QB1, obviously he was, but just for the sake of comparing the past 5 seasons, his 4,306 passing yards are higher than the lowest of 3,127 by Lamar Jackson. His 29 touchdowns were the minimum. His 524 rushing yards were definitely higher than the average of 358. And obviously, he broke a rushing touchdown record, so his 15 rushing touchdowns were definitely more than the minimum 4. Then when we compare his stats to the average, his 4,306 passing yards were a little bit under the 4,326 average. His 29 passing touchdowns were definitely below the 36 average. His 524 rushing yards were definitely below the 654 average. However, his 15 touchdowns were much higher than the 8 average, and that's kind of what balanced out his fantasy finish for him. And when we look at his 24.2 fantasy points per game, that was lower than the 24.4 fantasy points per game of the QB1 the past 5 seasons combined. And once again, that's using a 4 points per touchdown format, but only 0.2 points off. So this guy is absolutely a threat to be the QB1 this season. The next quarterback we'll be discussing is Patrick Mahomes of the Kansas City Chiefs. This past season, he was the QB8 overall, which is much worse than we've come to expect from him, as well as his 18.4 fantasy points per game. Well, to be fair to him, he had nobody to throw to out there, and he really can't make his players get open or catch the ball. Kadarius Toney and Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Sorry, it happens sometimes when I talk about Mahomes. Well, when we think about his situation this season, they signed Hollywood Brown and drafted Xavier Worthy, so they now have 2 deep threat playmakers, as well as Travis Kelce and Rashee Rice underneath, and also Isaiah Pacheco at running back. This offense is going to go back to being incredibly efficient, and Mahomes is going to return to consistent fantasy dominance for us in 2024. So Mahomes is 6'2", 225 pounds, and he's 28.9 years old. When we look at his passing yards, his 4,184 were good for 6th. His .47 fantasy points per dropback, however, were good for 17th, and in reality 18th, depending on which cutoff you use. His 7.3 accuracy rating versus man was good for 4th. His 7.8 accuracy rating versus zone was also good for 4th. His overall accuracy rating, however, of 6.5 was only good for 15th. When we look at his rushing stats here, this isn't where he eats generally. His 75 carries were 8th, however, which is a little bit impressive and higher than you would expect from Patrick Mahomes. However, his 4.7 per game were only 14th. His 13 red zone carries were top 10, though, finishing at 9. His .8 were good for 16th. His 389 rushing yards were good for 7th. And his 24.3 rushing yards per game were good for 14th. So one thing to conclude here is a lot of quarterbacks were hurt, including some that would have a very, very high rushing floor. So his end-of-year totals were a little bit higher, while if you look at his per-game averages, they're definitely a little bit lower than his ending numbers would suggest. But overall, he's absolutely elite. So one thing I did for any one of these quarterbacks who didn't actually play all 17 games is I figured out their per-game averages and then divided by how many games they played and multiplied by 17 to get you an idea of if they had played all 17 games, what their ending stats would have been like. So for instance, Mahomes would have finished with 4,445 passing yards, which definitely would have beaten the low mark of 3,127 by Lamar. His 29 touchdowns would have met the minimum by Josh Allen. His 413 rushing yards would have beaten the minimum by Patrick Mahomes in 2022 with 358. However, he had 0 rushing touchdowns, so that's definitely lower than the minimum threshold of 4. When we look at the average stats by the QB1 overall the past couple of seasons, Mahomes' 4,445 yards would have been a little bit higher than the 4,326 average. His 29 passing touchdowns, however, would have been much lower than the 36 average. His 413 rushing yards would have been lower than the 654 average. and his 0 touchdowns is definitely going to be lower than the 8 touchdowns average. And his 18.4 fantasy points per game is definitely going to be lower than the 24.4 points per game average. However, we've seen much higher marks from him, and with them adding Xavier Worthy as well as Hollywood Brown to this offense to add a vertical component to the offense, along with Kelsey and Rashee Rice being underneath and a solid running game with Pacheco, Patrick Mahomes definitely has a chance to return to a much higher points per game average this season, and he's absolutely a threat to be the QB1 this year. The next quarterback on this list is Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. This past season, he was the QB2 overall, averaging 21.9 fantasy points per game. When we look at his fantasy points per game totals, his rookie season, his 7.6 was a blip on the radar. In his second season, it went all the way up to 21.4, which was good for sixth. Then in 2022, his 25.6 was first. And this past season, once again, his 21.9 was good for second. When we think about his situation, it's elite. His offensive line is one of the best in football, despite Jason Kelsey retiring. The offensive playmakers on the outside in Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown are elite. He has an above-average tight end in Dallas Goedert. And now he has an elite running back in Saquon Barkley. There's two ways to look at this signing of Saquon Barkley. Yes, the offense is going to be more efficient, but then the downside is he's likely to have a lot more rushing touchdowns than DeAndre Swift did this past season. So whether the signing of Barkley helps or hurts him remains to be seen, but regardless, he's still going to be elite for us in fantasy. So Jalen Hurts is 6'1", 222 pounds, and he's 26 years old. When we look at his metrics, his 4.59 40-yard dash is in the 93rd percentile. However, his 53 mile-per-hour throwing velocity is in the 24th percentile. That's not where he hurts you. He hurts you in the running game. And his Wonderlic score was 3rd percentile, but I don't pay much credence to that. When we look at his passing yards, his 38.58 were good for 14th. His 0.65 fantasy points per dropback were good for 4th or 5th, depending on your minimum threshold for dropbacks. His 6.9 accuracy rating versus man was good for 12th. His 7.2 accuracy rating versus zone was good for 15th. And his 6.7 overall accuracy rating was good for 5th. But once again, he hurts you the most through the ground. His 157 carries were first. His 9.2 carries per game were good for 3rd. His 44 red zone carries were first. His 2.6 red zone carries per game were first. His 605 rushing yards were 3rd. His 35.6 rushing yards per game were 3rd. And his 15 touchdowns obviously broke a record, so they were definitely first, tied with Josh Allen. This guy gives you, once again, one of the highest floors in the game with a very elite ceiling because of his rushing ability. Now, we'll have to see about with Saquon Barkley there, whether it really helps him with the offense being more efficient or if it hurts him because he might not give you the rushing floor that he did this past season. And when we look at his stats, he played all 17 games. But when we look at these stats versus the minimum thresholds to be the QB1, his 38.58 passing yards were over the 31.27 necessary for the minimum at least. His 23 passing touchdowns did not meet the minimum threshold of 29. His 605 rushing yards did, however, meet the minimum threshold of 358. And obviously his 15 rushing touchdowns met the minimum threshold of 4. When we look at these stats versus the average of the QB1, his 38.58 passing yards were below the 43.26 necessary. His 23 passing touchdowns were well below the 36 average. His 605 rushing yards were a little bit below the 654 average, but his 15 rushing touchdowns definitely beat out the 8 average. And when we look at his fantasy points per game, his 21.9 did not meet the average of 24.4. I don't particularly think that he's going to have a higher ceiling this season with Saquon Barkley there, but it's possible that he could potentially be more effective through the air and offset that. Anything's possible, but I do think it's going to limit his ceiling with Barkley there. But he's still a threat to be the QB1 because he still has one of the best rushing upsides that there is for a quarterback. The next player on this list is Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. This past season, he was the QB4 overall, averaging 21.1 fantasy points per game. When we look at his career points per game, he had 10 as a rookie. That's a blip on the radar. He had 28.2 in his first MVP season, which was first in 2019. Then it did dip down to 22.8, which was 8th. then dipped again to 21.1, which was 7th, then dipped again to 20.3, which was 6th in 2022, before going back up this past season to 21.1, which was 3rd. When we think about his situation, it's been fine throughout his career, but it definitely could have been better. They've never had a good receiver, let alone an elite one, until they drafted Zay Flowers this past season. And just to clarify, he's good. He's not elite or anything. And he's a fine flanker and slot receiver. I still wish they would get him an elite wide receiver one, but I can hope and dream forever. Regardless, they still have Mark Andrews, who is an elite tight end, and they also have Isaiah Likely, who I think is an above average tight end if he would get a chance to play more often. Hopefully they run more 12 personnel. I think they might because they signed Derrick Henry. And so I look at Derrick Henry as potentially helping him, but also limiting his ceiling. Derrick Henry is probably going to score a lot of rushing touchdowns this season, but he's also going to improve the efficiency. So just like Jalen Hurts, we'll have to play it by ear and see how this affects his fantasy points per game. But regardless, he's still going to be an elite QB for us in 2024. So Lamar Jackson is 6'2", 216 pounds. He's 27.6 years old. When we look at his metrics, his 4.44 40-yard dash is in the 99th percentile for a quarterback, while his throw velocity of 49 miles per hour is only in the 2nd percentile. Just like with Jalen Hurts, he mostly hurts you through the ground. When we look at his passing yards, his 36.78 were good for 15th. His 0.68 fantasy points per dropback, depending on your cutoff, is either 1st or 2nd. His accuracy rating versus man, however, is 34th in the NFL, as well as his accuracy rating versus zone, giving him an overall 31st accuracy rating overall, which is weird because his pressured catchable pass rate was good for 7th in the NFL. So it's almost as if he's better being pressured than he just is generally in a clean pocket. But just like with a lot of the quarterbacks before, he mostly hurts you through the ground. His 148 carries were good for 2nd. His 9.3 carries per game were also good for 2nd. His 32 red zone carries were good for 3rd. His 2.0 red zone carries per game were good for 3rd. His 821 rushing yards were 1st. His 51.3 rushing yards per game were also 1st. And his 5 rushing touchdowns were good for 4th. Now, he did not play in all 17 games, so I figured out his per game averages and multiplied them by 17. So comparing his 17 game pace to the low thresholds, his 39.08 passing yards would have beaten out the 31.27 passing yard minimum. His 26 touchdowns would have still finished lower than the 29 minimum. His 872 rushing yards, however, would have beaten out the minimum of 358, and his 5 touchdowns would have beaten the minimum of 4. Then when we look at his 17 game pace stats versus the averages, his 3,908 passing yards would have been lower than the 43.26. His 26 passing touchdowns would have been 10 lower than the 36 average. However, his 872 yards would have beaten out the 654 average, while his 5 rushing touchdowns definitely would have been lower than the 8. So his 21.1 points per game were definitely lower than the 24.4. But this next season, if he is able to get a couple more rushing touchdowns and a couple more passing touchdowns, he's definitely a threat to be the QB1 overall. I just wouldn't have him as the favorite. The next quarterback on this list is CJ Stroud of the Houston Texans. This past season, he was the QB11 overall, averaging 18.7 fantasy points per game. If he had played all 17 games, he would have finished a little bit higher than QB11. He did miss a couple due to injury. But when we think about his situation, it's pretty elite. He has Bobby Slowick as his offensive coordinator who runs the Shanahan scheme. He was a member of the 2013 Washington team. So at least for 2024, we're safe in terms of the offensive philosophy for the Texans. When we look at his receiving core, it's pretty elite. Nico Collins is an above-average X-receiver. Tank Dell is a tremendous slot and flanker. And then they traded for Stephon Diggs. So they have a trifecta of stud wide receivers now. Then Dalton Schultz is, in my opinion, an above-average tight end. And they also signed Joe Mixon. So this is going to be a complete offense, and it's going to improve the offensive efficiency, which was already pretty good this past season. The only issue with CJ Stroud, he really doesn't rush the ball at all. However, if we've learned anything, if somebody can be incredibly efficient through the air, like Mahomes in his second season and in 2022, There is a chance that he's the QB1 overall. Now, we would have to see a ton of improvement from CJ Stroud, but to be fair to him, he was already, well, he had the best rookie season we've ever seen from a quarterback. So he would be a good bet to, if anybody, have a lot of improvement in his second season. So CJ Stroud is 6'3", 214 pounds, and he's still only 22.9 years old. When we look at his workout metrics, his 4.79 40-yard dash is in the 63rd percentile. So he is capable theoretically of having rushing upside, even though he just didn't display much of any this past season. When we look at his passing yards, his 41.08 were good for 8th. His 0.52 fantasy points per dropback were either 11th or 12th. His accuracy rating versus man was good for 27th, which is a lot lower than I thought it was going to be. His accuracy rating versus zone, however, was good for 11th. His overall accuracy rating was a lot lower than I thought it would be at 24th overall. However, his deep ball catchable pass rate was good for 8th in the NFL, so that's pretty good. However, his rushing upside is something he's almost certainly going to have to improve in order to finish as the QB1. Otherwise, he would just have to be basically 2017 or 2022 Patrick Mahomes. So his 39 carries were good for 19th. His 2.6 per game were good for 38th. His 8 red zone carries were good for 20th. His 0.5 red zone carries per game were good for 27th. His 167 rushing yards were good for 21st. His 11.1 per game were good for 31st. And his 3 rushing touchdowns were good for 12th. So when we take a look at his 17-game pace, end-of-year stats, he didn't play all 17 games this past season. Compared to the minimum thresholds to be the QB1, his 46.56 passing yards would have beaten out the 31.27 minimum. His 26 touchdowns would have been 3 short of the 29 minimum. His 189 rushing yards wouldn't have beaten out the 358 minimum, and his 3 rushing touchdowns would not have met the 4 minimum. When we look at the average thresholds, his 46.56 passing yards would have beaten the average of 43.26. However, his 26 touchdowns would have fallen 10 short. His 189 rushing yards would not have beaten out the 654, and his 3 rushing touchdowns would definitely not have met the minimum threshold of 8. So overall, the one thing is he does theoretically have the upside. He just needs to improve as a passer to the point where he's basically Patrick Mahomes, which does sound like a lot because it is. Not almost nobody's. We may never see a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes again. But the thing is, he did have the best rookie season ever, and now they also have Stephon Diggs. So now he has Diggs, Nico, and Tank Dell. They also at least are projected to have a better running game with Joe Mixon there. So the offensive efficiency could get even better. He definitely could take a step up. And so if he's able to have one of those Mahomes-like seasons, there is a chance that he's the QB1. He just definitely wouldn't be my favorite this season. The next quarterback on this list is Anthony Richardson of the Indianapolis Colts. So this past season, he was only the quarterback 41 overall, averaging 18.4 fantasy points per game, if you include all 4 games in which he played. Now, in 2 of the 4 games, he only played in 32 and 33% of the snaps. However, in one of the games in which he only played 32% of the snaps, he had 17.74 fantasy points. In the 2 games in which he played 96% or greater of the snaps, he was a top 4 quarterback in both weeks, and he finished second in the other week with almost 30 fantasy points. This guy is the definition of upside. Another fun fact, he was on pace to break the rushing touchdown just set by Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen, who had 15. He was on pace for 17 this past season. This guy is going to be elite if he can stay healthy. That's where the concern is. Can he stay healthy? While in fantasy football, I like to draft for upside, not for floor. And Anthony Richardson is the definition of upside. When we think about his situation, he has, in my opinion, the best head coach for developing quarterbacks in Shane Steichen. He's developed the likes of Justin Herbert and Jalen Hurts. And Jalen Hurts more closely compares to Anthony Richardson than Justin Herbert does, but Justin Herbert's also a better passer. So the track record for Shane Steichen is definitely there. And Anthony Richardson really does get an unfair rap for, yes, he doesn't have the best accuracy, especially when his footwork isn't on point. But mentally, he is absolutely there as a quarterback. He uses deception and eye manipulation to get what he wants in the passing game. He has a cannon of an arm and very, very good touch on the deep ball. He just needs to work on being a little bit more consistent with his short area throws. Now, as far as the situation, obviously he has a great head coach, and it is his head coach, which does look good for the furtherance of his career. Well, he has Michael Pittman at Z. He is one of the better Z receivers in the NFL. They just drafted A.D. Mitchell to be a vertical X. I do like him. Then Josh Downs is one of the better slot receivers in the NFL. Then he also has an above average offensive line and Jonathan Taylor at running back. This offense is going to be very, very efficient, and he is going to dominate in fantasy football just as long as he can stay healthy. So Anthony Richardson is 6'4", 244 pounds, and now he's only 22.2 years old despite going into his second season in the NFL. So he definitely does have the room to grow a lot. He also has barely played any games in high school, college, and the NFL. So we definitely have not seen the maximum upside of Anthony Richardson. But when we look at the metrics here, his 4.43 40-yard dash is in the 99th percentile, and his 135.4 burst score, which is his vertical and broad jump, give him also a 99th percentile score there. This guy is literally the most athletic quarterback we have ever seen in the NFL. And now, while he has a ton of improvement to do to be a long-term starter in the NFL or potentially be an elite quarterback, once again, for fantasy purposes, we don't care if you're actually a good quarterback. That doesn't matter. All that matters is being able to score fantasy points. So, yes, his catchable pass rate of 72.6% was good for 29th. We know that he's not the best passer. However, if you take the 2 games in which he played 96% or more of the snaps, he averages 25.7 fantasy points per game. That's more than Josh Allen's 24.2 fantasy points per game. And yes, it's a small sample size, but he does have that upside. I mean, in the 2 games in which he played 96% or more of the snaps, he was a top 4 and top 2 quarterback in both of those weeks. You don't just happen to be a top 4 quarterback in the only 2 starts in which you played that many percent of the snaps by accident. He is that good at getting us fantasy points. By the way, if you use a minimum threshold of 80 dropbacks, his 0.73 fantasy points per dropback were good for first in the NFL. So once again, if he's able to stay healthy, there is a very, very good chance that he is the number 1 quarterback for us in 2024 fantasy football. So as far as his rushing floor, his 25 carries were good for 35th, but once again, he didn't play that many games. His 6.3 rushing attempts, though, were good for 8th. His 8 total red zone carries were only 20th, but his 2.0 per game were good for 3rd. His 136 rushing yards were only good for 27th, but his 34 per game were good for 5th. And despite only playing in 4 games and only playing in 33 and 32% in 2 of those 4 games, his 4 rushing touchdowns were 7th in the NFL. Like I said, he was on pace to have 17 and break the rushing touchdown record just set by Allen and Hurts. So when we take the 2 games in which he played basically the entire set of snaps, divide that out by 2 and multiply it by 17, his 17-game pace would have been 3598 passing yards, 26 passing touchdowns, 816 rushing yards, and 17 rushing touchdowns. When we compare that to the minimum thresholds to be the QB1, his 3598 passing yards would have beaten out the 3127, his 26 passing touchdowns would have been 3 short of the 29 minimum, his 816 rushing yards would have beaten the minimum of 358, and his 17 rushing touchdowns obviously would have beaten the minimum of 4. When we compare that to the averages, his 3598 passing yards would have been a little bit lower than the 4326 passing yards average. His 26 touchdowns would have been 10 short of the 36 pass touchdown average. However, his 816 rushing yards would have beaten the average of 654, and his 17 rushing touchdowns would have beaten the average of 8. Now, his 25.7 fantasy points per game would have been higher than the 24.4 fantasy points per game average of all the QB1s the past 5 seasons. So, he does have the theoretical upside to be better than the average QB1 over the past 5 seasons. If he's able to stay healthy, he is absolutely a legitimate threat to be the QB1. So a couple of honorable mentions here. First of all, we have Jaden Daniels of the Washington Commanders. He's been compared to a stretch Kyler Murray and a little bit to Lamar Jackson. He's kind of a mixture of both. So as far as his rushing upside, he doesn't really possess the elite awareness as a rusher and assortment of juke moves and hezzy moves that Lamar Jackson possesses. But his speed is more like that of Lamar Jackson compared to Kyler Murray. So once again, I think he's a little bit more like Kyler Murray in that he does have good speed and he can scramble. It's just that he's not quite as dynamic of a runner of the football. But make no mistake, he does possess the theoretical upside to be the QB1 overall, and he does, in my opinion, possess 800 to 1,000 total rushing yard upside potentially. He is, however, going to have to be a very good quarterback in order to finish as a QB1 because his situation is just not that good. I mean, he does have Terry McLaurin as wide receiver 1, and it's a shame for Terry McLaurin that it's taken this amount of time for him to have what projects to be a good quarterback. And they drafted Ben Sinnott, so we'll see. He's a rookie tight end, so you generally don't expect rookie tight ends to do that much, even though we've been blessed with Pitts, Laporta, and Kincaid recently. But overall, it's a very poor situation for him, but he is a good prospect, and he does possess QB1 overall upside. Then we have Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears. He has traits of Aaron Rodgers, traits of Mahomes. I personally believe in him, and I think he's going to be one of, if not the best quarterback in the NFL very, very soon. He has top 3 arm talent in that he can throw the ball anywhere he wants on the field, anytime he wants to. We've already seen in the preseason that his pocket awareness is amazing. He regularly finds himself spinning outside the pocket, which isn't a good thing all the time. He doesn't like to play in structure as much as we would all pray he would. But to be fair to him, when he doesn't play in structure, he's very, very good. We all saw that play where he was roaming around in the pocket, then he rolled and did a spin move to the left side of the field, and then he did a running jump man throw to Rome Odunze, probably 40 yards down the field. That was absolutely crazy. And when we think about his situation, he has Keenan Allen in the slot, DJ Moore as a flanker, and Rome at X. In my opinion, that is the best trio of receivers in the NFL. Then he has Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett at tight end. Very, very good. Then he does have DeAndre Swift, who is an above-average pass catcher at the running back position, along with 2 bookend tackles that should be able to protect him relatively well. So personally, I do believe in him this season, and he does have the theoretical upside to be the QB1 overall, because one fun fact, in college, in 2 of his 3 collegiate seasons, he had 10 rushing touchdowns, and he's probably like a low 4.4, about 4.5 speed quarterback, which is right on par with Kyler Murray. His rushing upside is definitely underrated. He could perennially be a Mahomes type of player that gets us, 400 to maybe 500 rushing yards and maybe 8 to 10 touchdowns on a good season rushing the ball. But he could give us Aaron Rodgers or Mahomes passing stats as well. So he does have the theoretical upside, even though it would be tough to project him or even Jaden Daniels to be the QB1 as a rookie. Then when we go to Jordan Love, this past season in the second half, he looked like Aaron Rodgers, basically. He's in a fantastic situation with LaFleur as his head coach, who was also a member of the 2013 Washington team, so he runs the Shanahan scheme, but his twist on it. He doesn't really have an established number 1 playmaker, but I do like a good amount of his playmakers. I like Dontavian Wicks as a sleeper this season. Romeo Doubs can be a situational X receiver. Christian Watson is a fine Z receiver for them. And Jaden Reed, I really like. He is a very good slot or flanker. Then he has 2 solid tight ends in Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. And they did just sign Josh Jacobs, so the offense should be a little bit more efficient this season, which is scary if you're... Really, the NFC North is going to be really good this season. And so Jordan Love did finish as a QB5 this past season, although I do think it was a little bit inflated by a couple of QB injuries. But if he improves upon what he showed us in the second half of this past season and the playoffs as well, he does have the theoretical upside to be the QB1 overall. Then we have Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals. How quickly people forget how dominant this guy is on the ground. Fun fact, he was on pace to be the QB6 if he had played a full allotment of games. Now he gets Marvin Harrison Jr. added. He already has a connection with star tight end Trey McBride. Those are two very good playmakers for him. Outside of that, it could definitely be a lot better, but they have James Conner and they drafted Trey Benson, so he should have a good running game to help keep the pressure off of him. And he definitely does have the ability to be a QB1, and not only that, but the QB1 due to his rushing upside. He's already had an 819 and 11 rushing touchdown season en route to a QB3 overall finish. There is nothing stopping him from repeating that, really. And he has, in my opinion, you could argue DeAndre Hopkins during that season he had with him where he had about 1,500 yards. But Marvin Harrison Jr. is the best wide receiver prospect we've seen in some time. So with him and Trey McBride there and a solid running game, Kyler Murray possesses a crazy amount of upside, and he is my dark horse candidate to be the QB1 this year. Now we have Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys. So he did finish as a QB3 overall. Kind of a funny thing with him, he goes on these stretches where he puts up 30 points in a game week after week after week and then just disappears. His situation does leave a lot to be desired. He has an elite wide receiver 1 in CeeDee Lamb, one of the best receivers in the game, but after that, his situation is just not that great. The offensive line is definitely not what it once was, especially since Travis Frederick retired. His wide receiver 2 is Brandon Cooks, who perennially has been underrated, but at this stage of his career, he would be better if he was your wide receiver 3 than your wide receiver 2. And Jake Ferguson is a really average tight end, but Dak does make him look really, really good. The running game with Rico Dowdle and Zeke Elliott is not going to be the best either, so that potentially could help or hurt him. It might hurt the overall efficiency, but it may give him a boost in stats if they have to throw the ball more. So he does possess QB1 overall upside. He would just need to have a season in which he had more of those stretches of 30-point games and less of those games where he's just freezing cold and really doesn't perform well. Next, we have Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. Out of all these quarterbacks, I think he has the least potential chance to be the QB1, but if he has a very, very good year passing, he definitely could be. He's already finished as a QB4 and QB7 before, so if he just has a little bit better of a season than his QB4 finish, there is a chance. When you think about his playmakers, he has T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase is a premier wide receiver. T. Higgins is a little bit overrated in my opinion, but he is a good jump ball winner. Then his tight end situation is a little bit better this year. They have Mike Gesicki, who definitely hasn't done anything the past 2 seasons, but throughout his career had been a very, very good tight end. They drafted Eric All. I do like him as a prospect, and I think in the future he's going to be good. The running game isn't going to be as good as it once was. They have Zach Moss, who's very overrated, and Chase Brown is a fine pass catcher, but I don't really think that he should ever be a featured back. And so after losing Joe Mixon, I do think it's going to hurt their offensive efficiency, which could also make it so that he has to throw the ball more and then might help his stats. So it could go either way, I guess, but overall, he would really need to have a Patrick Mahomes-like season from 2017 or 2022 if he was going to be the QB1. But he is a very, very talented real-life quarterback. And with Jamar Chase at wide receiver, it's definitely possible. So my pick is Anthony Richardson of the Indianapolis Colts. I'm sure I'll receive a lot of disagreement in the comments section. I don't care. He has the most upside of any quarterback there is. If he plays all 17 games, I do think he will lead the league in fantasy points. And remember, in the 2 games in which he played 96% or more of the total snaps, he averaged more points per game than Josh Allen. That is a small sample size, but when we think about his situation, the only difference is now they also have A.D. Mitchell. They didn't lose anybody. And in fact, he has Jonathan Taylor now, which will help the run game and the offense in general be more efficient. He receives a lot of hate, and people really think that he is the most raw quarterback ever. Really, he does need to work on his footwork and base and getting lined up at times, which is the reason why some of these short passes are inaccurate. But his touch on the deep ball is really good. He has a cannon for an arm. He has unparalleled athleticism at the quarterback position. And he was on pace, although it was a small sample size, to have 17 rushing touchdowns this past season. This guy, if he plays all 17 games, is the ultimate cheat code for fantasy football. He's never, in my opinion, going to be the best real-life quarterback. I don't think he'll be much better than, at best, a potentially above-average quarterback. But fantasy football does not care if you are an elite, actual, real-life quarterback or not. It just cares about you scoring fantasy points. This guy, in the 2 games in which he played 96% or more of the snaps this past season, averaged more points than Josh Allen. In those 2 games, he was a QB4 and QB2. If he plays all 17 games, Anthony Richardson will be the QB1 for us in fantasy football in 2024. So those are the quarterbacks that do possess the theoretical upside to be the QB1, including my personal favorite to be the QB1 if he plays a full allotment of games. But what do you think? Do you agree, disagree? Who's your favorite to be the QB1 for us in 2024 fantasy football? Let me know in the comment section below and let me know why. With that being said, please like and subscribe. I would love to be able to continue doing these videos. Thank you and have a good day.